Captain Harold Mitchell banks his C-119 Flying Boxcar into a descending spiral over the Pacific, rear cargo door yawning open, chasing a white parachute falling through 10,000 feet. 15 minutes of fuel remain in the tanks. A 50-pound steel hook trails 15 feet behind his tail, and the parachute below carries something no radio could transmit: physical film exposed in orbit above the Soviet Union. If Mitchell misses, the capsule sinks and weeks of satellite reconnaissance vanish into saltwater. There is no digital backup, no second chance, no plan beyond this: catch a tumbling object mid-air before the ocean does. Earlier that morning, Mitchell had flown his C-119 in a wide holding pattern 150 miles northwest of Hawaii, waiting. The satellite orbited overhead, invisible against the daylight sky, and the crew had no way to know when it would release its cargo. The only signal was a VHF tone broadcast from the capsule itself once it separated from the satellite bus. Until that tone arrived, the crew circled, burning fuel, watching the clock. 40 minutes remained at loiter speed when the radio crackled with the re-entry signal. The VHF tone meant the film capsule had separated from the Corona satellite and begun its fall through the upper atmosphere. A heat shield protected the canister during re-entry, slowing it from orbital velocity to terminal descent speed. The capsule would fall for several minutes before deploying its parachute at 60,000 feet, high enough that the crew could not yet see it. The tone gave them a starting point, but no exact position. The navigator had to calculate where the capsule would appear based on satellite trajectory and wind model. Navigator Lieutenant Carver plotted the predicted impact zone using the satellite's last known position and prevailing wind data from a weather aircraft flying ahead of them. The result was a 5-mile diameter circle where the capsule should deploy its parachute and drift down over 15 minutes. 5 miles sounds generous, until you realize the parachute is 20 feet across and the aircraft is traveling at 150 miles per hour. Carver gave Mitchell a heading and an altitude: descend to 12,000 feet and turn southwest. They had 15 minutes to find a white dot against clouds. Mitchell calculated the mission profile in his head as he descended: 40 minutes of fuel at the start, subtract 10 minutes for the intercept dive, and 10 more for the return climb to base altitude. That left 15 minutes at low altitude to find and hook the parachute. No margin for a second search pattern. No reserve for holding if they arrived early. The fuel gauge became the mission clock, and every maneuver subtracted seconds. If they aborted, the capsule would hit the ocean and sink, flooding the film canister within minutes. Navy divers could not reach it in time. Loadmaster Sergeant Dawson stood at the rear of the cargo bay and unlocked the massive clamshell door, hydraulics groaning as it swung upward and locked against the fuselage. Wind roared through the opening, 150 miles per hour of slipstream turning the cargo bay into a wind tunnel. Dawson wore a flight suit, goggles, and a communications headset, but no safety harness rated for open-door operations existed in 1960. He braced against a cargo strap and extended the steel trapeze hook 15 feet behind the tail on a winch cable, watching it stabilize in the slipstream. At 12,000 feet, Carver spotted the parachute: a white dot against gray clouds descending at 30 feet per second, drifting southwest with the prevailing wind. The capsule hung beneath it, invisible at this distance, a 50-pound cylinder of film and metal. Mitchell throttled back to 150 miles per hour and adjusted his descent rate to match the parachute's fall. The geometry looked simple: fly above the target, match its speed, let the hook trail behind and snag the canopy. But the parachute was not stationary. It swung, drifted, oscillated in the wind, a moving target inside a narrow capture zone. Mitchell began his descent, eyes locked on the parachute, throttling back to hold position 50 feet above it. Carver started the stopwatch, 15 minutes on the clock. The crew had rehearsed this intercept dozens of times over the Pacific, chasing practice parachutes dropped from other aircraft. But those parachutes had not carried film exposed in orbit. Those failures had cost nothing but fuel and time. This one carried intelligence that no U-2 flight could capture and no radio could transmit. If they missed, The Cold War surveillance gap remained unfilled. The clock ran. The parachute drifted. Mitchell held his position and waited for Dawson's call. The trapeze hook extended only 15 feet behind the aircraft's tail. That fixed geometry created a capture zone, a corridor roughly 10 feet wide and 20 feet long, where the hook could engage the parachute shroud lines. Fly too slow and the parachute drifts ahead, out of reach. Fly too fast and the capsule strikes the tail section, potentially severing control cables or tearing through the vertical stabilizer. The acceptable closure rate was 10 miles per hour, roughly 15 feet per second. Slow enough to avoid collision, but fast enough to close the gap before fuel ran out. Dawson watched the parachute through the open cargo door and keyed his microphone. The capsule was swinging beneath the canopy, pendulum arcs roughly 20 feet wide, driven by wind shear between 10,000 and 8,000 feet. Every 5 seconds, the capsule completed one swing, left to right and back again. The shroud lines traced the motion, pulling the canopy edge down on one side and lifting it on the other. Mitchell tried to anticipate the swing, banking gently to follow, but by the time he adjusted course, the capsule had reversed direction. The parachute was not falling straight, it was dancing. Mitchell aligned the aircraft behind the parachute, matching altitude and descent rate, and pushed the throttles forward to close the gap at 10 miles per hour. For 3 seconds, the geometry held, hook trailing behind, parachute centered in the capture zone ahead. Then a gust hit. The parachute drifted 30 feet to the right in less than 5 seconds, sliding out of the hook's path and dropping below the aircraft. By the time Mitchell banked to correct, the parachute had drifted left again. The straight-line approach had failed. The target was moving faster than he could react. Carver pulled weather data from the reconnaissance aircraft flying ahead of them. Wind speed varied between 15 and 40 miles per hour, depending on altitude, creating unpredictable gusts as the parachute descended through different layers. The models could predict average drift over 10 minutes, but second-to-second motion was chaotic. Carver gave Mitchell updated drift vectors every 10 seconds, but the parachute's actual position lagged behind the numbers. The crew could not fly a fixed course. They had to adjust continuously, reacting to what they saw rather than what the math predicted. To track the parachute's lateral motion, Mitchell needed to bank continuously, adjusting every few seconds as the target drifted. But standard cargo procedures prohibited steep banks with the rear door open. The door hinges were rated for straight and level flight, and lateral loads during aggressive maneuvers could bend the hinge pins or crack the door frame. Shallow banks provided insufficient correction rate. By the time the aircraft completed a 10-degree turn, the parachute had already drifted past the intended intercept point. Mitchell faced a choice: follow the book and lose the capsule, or push the aircraft beyond its certified limits. Each bank maneuver cost airspeed, and regaining that speed burned extra fuel. Mitchell watched the gauge tick down faster than the mission profile predicted. Carver recalculated. They had 12 minutes remaining instead of 15. Every correction maneuver subtracted seconds, tightening the window. The crew could execute perhaps 2 more intercept attempts before fuel reserves forced them to climb back to base altitude. After that, the capsule would hit the ocean alone. The 15-minute window was shrinking, and they had not yet touched the parachute. Mitchell keyed the intercom and told Dawson to brace for aggressive banks. He would accept 20-degree turns and momentary overspeed, trading structural margin for intercept probability. The door hinges might bend, the airframe might exceed design limits, but those were repairable failures. Missing the parachute was not. The capsule carried film that no other intelligence source could replace, and the mission cost $5 million and weeks of orbital positioning. Mitchell rolled into a 20-degree descending turn, feeling the airframe shudder as wind loads spiked across the open door. The parachute drifted left. He followed. Carver announced, 10 minutes of fuel remaining. That was the hard decision point. They could attempt one more intercept pass with enough reserve for a normal landing, or they could commit to a second pass and accept a low-fuel landing with no margin for go-around. A low-fuel landing meant one approach, no wave-off option if the runway was blocked or weather closed in. Mitchell looked at the parachute, still 200 feet ahead and drifting. He told Carver to plan for low fuel. They would make this work, or they would land on fumes. Either way, they were not leaving without the capsule. Mitchell rolled into a 20-degree descending turn, closing the final 200 feet of horizontal separation while descending through 9,500 feet. The parachute filled his windscreen, white canopy against gray clouds, shroud lines visible as fine threads radiating down to the capsule. Dawson called adjustments from the cargo door. Left 2 degrees, hold steady. Right 1 degree. Mitchell flew the corrections manually, trimming airspeed to match the parachute's drift, feeling the aircraft shudder as wind loads fluctuated across the open door. The hook trailed behind, 15 feet of steel waiting to engage. They had one pass. Dawson watched the parachute through the open door and keyed his microphone. The capsule was rotating, not drifting, not swinging, spinning counterclockwise, turning the shroud lines into a visible helix. He estimated 30 rotations per minute, 1 full turn every 2 seconds. This was not part of the training scenarios. The spinning motion was a re-entry artifact. Asymmetric heating and tumbling descent had imparted angular momentum to the capsule, and the parachute could not dampen it. The capsule spun, the shroud lines twisted, and Dawson realized the hook could not simply pierce the canopy. It had to enter at the right moment in the rotation cycle. Dawson counted rotations, timing them against his watch. The capsule completed 15 full turns in 30 seconds, 30 rotations per minute. Every 2 seconds, the shroud lines completed 1 cycle, twisting tight into a bundle, then relaxing back to parallel alignment. When the lines twisted together, they formed a narrow helix, with most of the load concentrated on 2 or 3 lines. When they relaxed, they spread into a cone, distributing load across the full canopy structure. The hook had to enter during the relaxed phase, or it would tear the parachute free. When the shroud lines twisted tight during the spin cycle, they formed a helical bundle, roughly 6 inches in diameter. All 16 lines converged into that bundle for a half second, concentrating tensile load. If the hook snagged that bundle, it would apply point load to 2 or 3 lines under maximum tension. The riser attachment point, where the shroud lines connected to the capsule, was rated for distributed load, not point stress. A snag during the twisted phase would shear the riser, tearing the parachute free from the capsule. The capsule would then free fall into the ocean at terminal velocity, exploding on impact and scattering film across miles of seabed. When the shroud lines relaxed, during the half-second phase when the capsule's rotation brought them back to parallel, they spread into a cone, roughly 10 feet across at the canopy skirt. The hook could pass through that cone and engage 4 or more lines simultaneously, distributing the snag load across the entire parachute structure. The canopy would partially collapse, but the riser would hold. Dawson had a half-second window every 2 seconds. Miss it, and he either tore the parachute free or waited another rotation cycle, burning fuel and drifting out of position. Mitchell held altitude 50 feet above the parachute, matching drift speed, while Dawson watched the lines cycle through twisted and relaxed phases. Mitchell throttled back to hold position 50 feet above the parachute, matching its descent rate of 30 feet per second and its horizontal drift speed. The aircraft shuddered in the turbulent air below 10,000 feet, and every gust required a correction. Dawson stood on the cargo ramp, one hand gripping a cargo strap, the other on the winch control lever, watching the shroud lines rotate. He called small adjustments to Mitchell. Left 1 degree, hold, nose down slightly. The hook trailed behind at eye level, 15 feet back, stable in the slipstream. They had fuel for 1 attempt, maybe 2 rotations if Mitchell could hold position without excessive maneuvering. Carver called out the fuel state, 11 minutes remaining. That was enough for 1 intercept pass and a straight-in landing with no reserve for go-around. If they aborted now, they could land normally, but the capsule would be lost. Mitchell acknowledged and held position. The decision was already made. They would hook the parachute on this pass or accept a low-fuel landing after a second attempt. The clock ran. The parachute spun. Dawson watched the shroud lines cycle through one rotation, then another, waiting for Mitchell to close the final gap and position the hook above the canopy during the next relaxed phase. The parachute canopy generated roughly 50 pounds of drag at 30 feet per second descent rate, holding the capsule's fall within the design envelope. That drag force was distributed across 16 shroud lines, radiating from the capsule riser to the canopy skirt. Each line carried approximately 3 pounds of load during steady descent. When the hook snagged the shroud lines, it would transfer that drag load from the parachute to the aircraft's winch system. The winch had to reel in the parachute without applying sudden tension that would collapse the canopy or exceed the cable's rated strength. The shroud lines rotated as a unit, driven by the capsule's angular momentum from re-entry tumbling. That rotation had 2 phases. During the twisted phase, centrifugal force and torsional stress pulled the lines together into a helical bundle. Tensile load concentrated on the innermost lines, which experienced both vertical drag and lateral tension from the rotating mass. During the relaxed phase, angular momentum carried the bundle past its twist point, and the lines spread back into a cone, relieving lateral tension and distributing load evenly. The transition between phases took roughly a quarter second, creating a narrow window when load distribution shifted from concentrated to distributed. The steel hook was barbed, designed to pierce fabric and catch on woven threads without tearing through. When it entered the shroud cone during the relaxed phase, it could pass between multiple lines and engage 4 or more simultaneously. Each engaged line transferred a portion of the parachute's drag load to the hook, and from the hook to the winch cable. The key was simultaneous engagement. If the hook snagged only 1 or 2 lines, those lines would bear the full 50 pounds of drag plus any dynamic loads from the aircraft's motion, exceeding their individual strength and causing a tear or separation at the riser attachment point. The winch motor could reel in 100 feet of cable at 5 feet per second, fast enough to pull the parachute into the cargo bay in roughly 20 seconds. But the critical moment was the first second after hook engagement. The hook introduced slack into the system. 15 feet of trailing cable suddenly under load as the parachute's drag transferred to the winch. If Dawson did not trigger the winch immediately, that slack would snap taut, generating a dynamic load spike potentially exceeding 1,000 pounds. That spike could pull the winch mount loose from the fuselage rail, snap the hook assembly, or tear the shroud lines from the riser. The winch had to start reeling in within 1 second of engagement. Dawson stood on the cargo ramp, one hand on the winch control lever, watching the hook trail 15 feet behind the aircraft at eye level. Wind through the open door created 40-mile-per-hour gusts across the ramp, buffeting his flight suit and pulling at his footing. He wore no safety harness rated for lateral pull because no such harness existed in 1960 for open-door cargo operations. Standard harnesses were designed to arrest vertical falls, not horizontal forces from a whipping cable or sudden winch load. If the cable snapped under load, it would whip back toward the cargo bay at lethal speed. If Dawson lost footing during winch activation, he would fall through the open door with no arrest system. When the winch reeled in the parachute, tension on the shroud lines would invert portions of the canopy, collapsing panels and reducing drag. That collapse would cause the capsule to swing in a pendulum arc as the center of drag shifted. The swinging capsule generated lateral loads on the winch cable and the hook assembly. If the swing exceeded 15 feet, roughly the length of the hook extension, the capsule could strike the aircraft's tail section or tangle in the cable, creating a mass oscillation that the winch could not dampen. Dawson had to reel in the parachute smoothly, avoiding sudden tension changes that would amplify the pendulum swing. Mitchell held position 50 feet above the parachute. Descent rate matched to 30 feet per second, airspeed 150 miles per hour. The aircraft shuddered as he trimmed throttle and elevator to balance the turbulent air. Carver confirmed they were centered in the predicted drift zone. Dawson watched the shroud lines cycle through one rotation. Twisted phase. The lines bunched together, a narrow helix. Relaxed phase. The lines spread into a cone. He waited for the next cycle. The hook trailed behind, 15 feet back, steady in the slipstream. Mitchell's hands were light on the controls, making micro corrections to hold geometry. Dawson watched the shroud lines complete one full rotation, then begin the relaxed phase. The lines spread into a cone, parallel alignment visible for a half-second window. He keyed his microphone and said one word: "Now." Mitchell nosed down 2 degrees, closing the vertical gap between the hook and the parachute. The aircraft descended through the final 20 feet in 3 seconds. The hook, trailing behind, passed through the shroud cone. Dawson felt the cable twitch as the barbed tip pierced fabric and engaged the lines. 4 lines simultaneously. The cable went taut. Dawson triggered the winch within 1 second of feeling the cable go taut. The motor engaged, spooling in cable at 5 feet per second. The parachute canopy inverted partially as tension pulled the shroud lines upward, collapsing one panel. The capsule, no longer supported symmetrically, swung 15 feet laterally in a pendulum arc. The motion was sudden, violent, a mass oscillation driven by the collapsing canopy. The winch cable tension spiked as the swinging capsule applied lateral load. Dawson watched the cable strain against the fuselage rail, metal flexing under 800 pounds of tension. The swinging capsule generated a lateral load spike that translated through the winch cable to the hook mount. The mount flexed against the fuselage rail, metal groaning as 800 pounds of tension pulled at the attachment bolts. Dawson braced against the cargo ramp edge, feeling the deck vibrate under his boots as the winch motor strained. The cable whipped taut, pulling the parachute assembly toward the cargo door. For 3 seconds, the outcome was uncertain. Either the mount would hold and the parachute would reel in, or the mount would fail and the entire assembly would whip back into the fuselage. The cable held. The mount held. The capsule swung back toward center. The winch reeled in the final 15 feet of cable, pulling the parachute and capsule assembly into the cargo bay. The canopy, partially collapsed, billowed through the open door like a deflated balloon. The capsule followed, swinging in a damped arc, and cleared the door threshold. It struck the cargo deck with a metallic clang, the impact absorbed by the parachute fabric still tangled around it. Dawson released the winch lever and grabbed the capsule with both hands, dragging it away from the door edge and securing it to the deck with tie-down straps. The film canister inside showed no breach seals, no impact damage. They had it. Mitchell closed the throttles momentarily, then advanced them to climb power. The C-119 pitched up, climbing through 12,000 feet and turning toward Hickam Air Force Base. The rear cargo door remained open. Dawson would close it once they reached stable altitude. Carver checked the fuel gauge and called out 7 minutes remaining. Enough for a straight-in approach with no margin for go-around, no reserve for weather holds. Mitchell acknowledged and set course for a direct approach. They had the capsule, but they were not safe yet. They had to land on fumes. Mitchell flew a straight-in approach to Hickam, no pattern, no standard spacing. Air traffic control cleared him direct to the runway, recognizing the low fuel emergency. The aircraft descended through 5,000 feet, engines throttled back to save the last drops of fuel. Carver monitored the gauge. 5 minutes, then 4, then 3. The runway appeared ahead, a concrete strip against green Hawaiian hills. Mitchell extended flaps and gear, feeling the drag increase, and trimmed for final approach speed. 2 minutes of fuel remained when the main wheels touched concrete. He braked hard, rolled to the first taxiway, and shut down the engines. Ground crew towed the C-119 the rest of the way. Ground crew towed the C-119 directly to the intelligence hangar, bypassing the normal parking area. Analysts met the aircraft as soon as the cargo door opened. Dawson handed them the capsule, still secured in tie-down straps. The analysts carried it into a clean room and extracted the film canister, a sealed cylinder roughly 18 inches long. They processed the 3,000-foot roll of exposed film that evening, revealing high-resolution images of Soviet ICBM sites that no U-2 flight had photographed. The film was intact. Every frame was usable. The mission was a success. The August 1960 recovery was designated Discoverer 14, the first successful mid-air snag of a satellite re-entry capsule. 13 previous attempts had failed. Missed intercepts, torn parachutes, capsules lost in the ocean. This mission validated the trapeze hook system and proved that cargo crews could perform a feat no transport aircraft had ever attempted. The film that satellites could not transmit had been caught mid-air by a crew willing to push their aircraft beyond certified limits. The method worked. The Air Force expanded the recovery fleet to 6 C-119 aircraft stationed across the Pacific, ensuring at least 2 aircraft were on station for every Corona re-entry. Later, the program transitioned to C-130 Hercules crews with extended fuel range, more powerful winch systems, and improved safety harnesses for Loadmasters. The basic method remained unchanged. Fly above a tumbling parachute, hook it mid-air, and reel it in before the capsule hits the ocean. The expanded fleet increased recovery success rates from roughly 30% in early missions to over 85% by the mid-1960s. Over the next 12 years, Corona missions returned 800,000 images using mid-air recovery. No alternative method proved reliable enough to replace the flying snag. Ocean pickup required Navy divers to reach the capsule within minutes before it sank, a logistical impossibility given the vast Pacific recovery zones. Ground landing required precise deorbit burns and favorable weather, constraints that reduced mission flexibility. Mid-air recovery, despite its difficulty, offered the highest success rate and the fastest intelligence turnaround. The film that could not wait became the film that cargo crews caught every time. The procedure's success depended on the same narrow margins every time: 15 minutes of fuel, 15 feet of hook extension, and a Loadmaster's judgment of when the shroud lines relaxed enough to engage without tearing. Those margins never widened. The C-130's extended range added loiter time, but the intercept geometry remained identical. The improved winch added power, but the hook still trailed 15 feet behind the tail. The safety harnesses reduced the risk of falls, but Loadmaster still stood on open ramps in 40-mile-per-hour wind. The mission got easier with practice, but the physics never changed. The success of mid-air recovery changed Air Force doctrine for satellite reconnaissance. Mission planners no longer designed satellites for ground recovery or ocean landing. They designed them for mid-air snag. Film canisters were built lighter and parachutes engineered for stable descent rather than survivable impact. The recovery system shaped the satellite design, reversing the usual relationship between payload and retrieval method. Corona became a system optimized around the moment a cargo crew hooked a parachute over the Pacific. Corona missions depended on satellites, film chemistry, orbital mechanics, and heat shields. But the final link in the intelligence chain was human. A pilot holding formation in turbulent air, a navigator predicting drift, and a Loadmaster timing the hook entry to a rotating parachute. The technology enabled reconnaissance, but the crew enabled recovery. Without them, every Corona mission ended in the ocean. The satellites gathered intelligence, but the cargo crews brought it home. The mid-air recovery technique developed for Corona influenced later programs. When the space shuttle began atmospheric test flights in the 1970s, recovery crews practiced parachute intercepts using the same hook and winch method. When unmanned aerial vehicles required mid-air recovery in the 1990s, Air Force planners studied Corona procedures. The flying snag, invented out of Cold War necessity, became a standard technique for retrieving objects that could not land safely on their own. The method persisted because the physics persisted: a falling object, a trailing hook, and a crew willing to fly close enough to catch it. Corona missions ended in 1972. Not because mid-air recovery failed, but because technology finally caught up. New reconnaissance satellites carry digital imaging systems and high-bandwidth transmitters capable of sending images to ground stations without physical film. The satellites that followed Corona, Keyhole, Lacrosse, and others, never required a parachute or a cargo crew. The film that could not wait became the film that was never needed. But for 12 years, when digital transmission was impossible, cargo crews performed a feat that kept Cold War surveillance alive. They caught falling satellites mid-air. Captain Harold Mitchell flew his last Corona recovery mission in 1965, 5 years after Discoverer 14. He had completed 27 successful intercepts, more than any other pilot in the program. He retired from the Air Force in 1970 and never spoke publicly about the missions until the Corona program was declassified in 1995. In interviews, he described the flying snag as the most difficult maneuver he had ever performed. Not because of the flying skill required, but because the consequences of failure were absolute. You caught it, or you lost it. And there was no second satellite waiting in orbit. One of the Discoverer capsules recovered by mid-air snag is displayed at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington. The capsule shows scorch marks from re-entry, creases where the parachute shroud lines pulled against the metal skin, and a small dent where it struck the cargo deck. Visitors walk past it without realizing that the dent was made at 12,000 feet over the Pacific by a Loadmaster who stood on an open ramp with no safety harness, watching shroud lines rotate, waiting for a half-second window to trigger a winch that pulled 800 pounds of spinning metal into a cargo bay traveling at 150 miles per hour. The film that could not wait, because 1960s satellites could not transmit high-resolution images, became the film that cargo crews caught mid-air, turning transport pilots into the final link in Cold War reconnaissance. For 12 years, every image of Soviet missile sites, airfields, and submarine pens depended on a crew's ability to fly within 50 feet of a spinning parachute, hook it during a half-second window, and reel it in before fuel ran out. The satellites were extraordinary, but the recovery was ordinary people performing an extraordinary feat. That is the story of Discoverer, Corona, and the cargo crews who caught buckets of film falling from orbit.